Welcome to our Bible study for February 12. The last 3 weeks before this week, we looked at the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, and then Matthew 6, and then Matthew 7. And Matthew ends that section of his gospel, the end of Matthew 7, by saying, when Jesus had finished teaching these things, and at the very end of Matthew 13 that we're looking at today, where Jesus teaches 8 different parables, again, Matthew says, when Jesus finished saying these things, and Matthew does that 5 times in his gospel, and it's kind of interesting. That's not probably an accident. In many ways, Matthew is showing that Jesus is the new Moses, and so just as Moses brought the 5 books of the law, the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, so Jesus has 5 bodies of teaching in the Gospel of Matthew. And as I said, we are in Matthew 13 today, and he's going to offer us 8 parables. Pretty amazing, 8 parables in just one chapter. I had a professor in college who really was my favorite professor, really of all time, and he and I got pretty close. He came to my wedding, and he came to my graduation when I graduated with my Doctor of Ministry, and we just kept up over the years. He passed away a few years ago. His name's Tom Buford. He wrote a book on the parables, and the title of the book was Ambushed on the Road to Glory. And his thesis was that Jesus' parables are told to us as we think we know the way. We think we know how to get to God. We think we know the way that God would have us go and the things that God would have us do. And we are just confidently on our way on that road to glory. And then Jesus kind of comes along and ambushes us, kind of throws a stick of dynamite in there and blows it all up because he surprises us with what he has to say in the parables. And this is absolutely true in Matthew 13. As a matter of fact, Jesus begins by telling the story of the sower, and we'll get to that in a few moments. But when he finishes, his disciples take him apart privately, and they say, Master, why are you telling everybody stories or teaching in parables? And it's almost like they say, why are you talking in riddles? Can't you just talk plainly? And Jesus somewhat oddly quotes Isaiah from Isaiah 6 when God says to Isaiah, when you go out, actually the people's ears are going to be stopped up and their eyes are going to be closed. And Jesus says, people's hearts have grown hard and their ears have grown hard of hearing and they have shut their eyes. But then he kind of promises, again, quoting from Isaiah, that if we will look and we will hear, then God will heal us. And when Jesus actually finishes the parable of the tares, he says to the people, if you have ears to hear, hear. And what he is saying is that you need to pay attention and you need to be open to this gospel, to this good news, but you need to be aware it's going to come as a surprise, as a shock, maybe even as an offense. And so after he explains that to the disciples, he then explains the parable of the sower. And so I want us to look at the parables. Our lesson writer in Encounter suggests that they really fall into 4 categories, and each category has 2 parables, and we won't look extensively at all 8, but I do want us to look at a representative of each of the 8 and each of the 4 categories. And the first category, which is the category of the sower, is the reception of the kingdom. How do we receive the kingdom? So the sower goes out and sows, sowing seed, and some of the seed falls on a hard path. It's all packed down, it's hard, and the seed can't germinate, it can't take root. And so it dies. The gospel is not received. And there, I think Jesus is talking about when we have hard hearts, when we just refuse to listen. And we all are that way from time to time for whatever reason. We have a hard heart, we refuse to listen, and the gospel can't take root. The next, as the sower continues, some of it falls on rocky soil, and he says the plants spring up, but then the sun comes out. They can't get good roots down in. They can't get themselves established. The sun comes up and scorches them, and they wither and die. And I want to suggest perhaps that what Jesus is telling us there is sometimes, again, we're talking about our hearts. Our hearts are so full of other things, and they may be good things. Family and friends and activities and whatever. But our hearts, or maybe even our lives, can be so full of other things that there's just no room for the gospel in there. And so maybe it takes root a little bit, but then it just withers and dies because there isn't room for it. Well, sower continues sowing, and some of the seed falls on thorny ground where there are already thorns and thistles growing up. And it grows up, but it just gets choked out by the thorns. And I'd like to suggest that, unlike the rocky soil, which perhaps is our hearts or our lives are full of good things, but just things that we don't allow room for the gospel, here we allow evil things, bad things to come into our lives, and that keeps the gospel out. We succumb to temptation again and again and again, and we listen more to temptation than we do to the gospel. And so the gospel is choked out. But then finally he says some of the seed falls on good soil, and it grows, it germinates, the roots go down, the plants come up, and it produces abundantly, maybe even more abundantly you can imagine. And Jesus there is saying to us, find a way to make your heart good, fertile soil for the gospel. And that does mean to listen and to see. It does mean to open our hearts up to Jesus, even when what he says is surprising or is shocking or even is, as I mentioned earlier, offensive. Jeremiah talks about, you're the potter and I'm the clay, and I heard someone say one time that their prayer was, God, if you're the potter and I'm the clay, help me make my clay soft so that you can do what you need to do with me, so you can mold me in the way that you want me. Don't let me resist you. Well, that's also, I think, the case with, I want my heart to be good soil, good, soft, fertile soil, so that you can do in me what you want to do in me. Well, the other parable of reception I do want us to cover just briefly, because it's one that most of us have never even heard of. It's in there. It just comes by so fast. And it's actually the last parable that Jesus tells in this passage. And it's the parable of the scribe. And he says, every scribe who becomes a disciple of mine is like a master of a household who goes and he gathers his treasures and he shows off the treasures, both the new and the old. And what I think Jesus is trying to say here is that the scribes were wonderful scholars of all of the treasures that are in what we call the Old Testament, the treasures in the scriptures that Jesus had at the time. And they dedicated their lives to trying to use those scriptures to be able to draw close to God and bring other people close to God. But then Jesus comes along and he's new. He's not different. He actually says in the Sermon on the Mount, I didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. But the way he fulfills it is so surprising that it's hard for them to grab onto. And so he says the scribe that becomes a disciple is the one that recognizes the old is still powerful and it's still a treasure, but the new is a treasure as well. And I think we are called to do the same thing, even in our day and age. It's easy for us to say, well, of course, I think there's treasure in the Old Testament and the New Testament. But what about the other treasures that we have that we need to make sure that we don't let the treasures of the past make us miss the treasures of the present? I'm reading a book right now that is about people that believe that the earth is flat. The Flat Earth Society, we sometimes say, even though there are several different of these societies and groups of people that believe the earth is flat. And they sincerely believe that we do not live on a globe, but it's a flat earth. And many of them believe it because of ways they've mistranslated the Bible. They are sincere Christians, or they want to be sincere Christians, and they read things like the Bible talking about the four corners of the earth and this kind of thing, and they read that rather literally, and they decide that the earth has to be flat. It can't be a globe. What I would suggest is they recognize the treasures of the old. They recognize the treasures in the scriptures, but they also fail to see the way that we have now learned that our planet is a globe, and there's a treasure in that, to see the marvel of creation. Scientists who are looking for other planets that might have life are looking for what they call Goldilocks planets. And those are planets that aren't too hot and aren't too cold. They're just right. And that's what our planet is. And there's a sense in which there's evidence of a creator because we live on this Goldilocks planet. And so rather than saying, well, it has to be flat and we have to discount anything that science tells us, what does science tell us not only about our planet, but about the glories and the wonder, the treasure that is our Creator? And so that would be maybe perhaps one application. So the parables of reception, how are we open to receiving whatever it is that Christ has for us, even if it sounds new or surprising or challenging? How are we open to it? And if we are, we can recognize, as he says, we will grow and flourish much more than we ever might imagine. And that leads us into the next category, and that is parables that are about the growth of the kingdom. And those are the two parables, the mustard seed and the yeast. The mustard seed's the tiniest little seed of all, and yet it becomes the biggest bush in the whole garden. You take this tiny little bit of yeast and you put it in the dough, and it's when you put it in the dough that the dough then rises and becomes so much more than it was before. And Jesus says that's the way the kingdom of heaven is. And how powerful that is. The kingdom initially seems so small and so insignificant and just inconsequential, a mustard seed, a tiny little bit of yeast. And yet when it is planted or when the yeast is put into the dough, it makes all the difference in the world. And first we can imagine that Jesus is speaking of himself. You may remember that poem from some time ago, One Solitary Life, how this one man that lived in this tiny little corner of the world, this peasant, had no place to lay down his head or anything else. This one single solitary life, it turns out, was God himself walking among us. And that one single solitary life changed the world forever and ever. That is the kingdom of heaven, and we find that in Jesus, this peasant, this carpenter, this single solitary life, living 2,000 years ago, living in this tiny little backwater in the world, nevertheless changing everything because he was God himself walking among us. Or you and I have no idea how much good we might do, how much kingdom growth might happen if we simply and powerfully, but just simply find ways to love and sacrifice for others, rather than holding it back for ourselves, but offering to others, following in the footsteps of Jesus. A simple act of love might totally change that person's life. They might change someone else's life, and they might change someone else, and it just exponentially grows. The kingdom of heaven is surprisingly made up of tiny, tiny things that later almost seemingly magically become tremendous. And so we are called to make sure that we are engaging in kingdom life even when it seems inconsequential or seems like it's not going to be that effective. We trust that it is. The next set of characteristic parables he gives us here are the worth of the kingdom. How much is the kingdom worth? And in there he tells the parable of the treasure hidden in the field and the pearl of great price. And in both of those parables, a person sells everything they have in order to possess this other thing. So particularly let's think of the treasure in the field. A man finds this treasure in the field and he sells everything he has and he gives it so he can buy that field, because he knows once he owns that field, the return on his investment will be so much greater than he can possibly imagine. So he gladly gives it all for that field. One way maybe to look at this would be to think about Coca-Cola. It is one of the most successful corporations in the history of the world. And when I think Pemberton was the man that invented Coca-Cola originally, he was making brown fizzy sugar water and selling it in drugstores. And when he initially made it, and they initially made their first stock offering, it didn't cost very much, I'm sure. It was before the Depression, and if you or I were to look at that and think, that just doesn't seem to make any sense at all. It's almost like the mustard seed or the yeast there. Why would I invest in brown fizzy sugar water? That can't possibly be a worthwhile investment. And yet Coke survives the Depression, and it grows and it grows and it grows. And if we had invested back then, and if we had the opportunity to go back in time now and invest, we might invest everything we have in it, because by now we would be wealthier than we can possibly imagine. With all the dividends it's paid over the years and all the ways the stock has grown and split and all of that stuff, we would be so amazingly wealthy. That's what Jesus is saying the kingdom of heaven is like. It may not look like that much to some people, those that have eyes that are shut or ears that are closed or hearts that are hardened, and yet if we recognize the kingdom of heaven returns back, not necessarily monetarily, of course, but returns back so much more, why would we not give everything that we are and everything that we have for the kingdom? That's the parables about what the kingdom is worth. More than we can imagine, but within our grasp, all we have to give is what little bit that we have. And then finally we have what our lesson writer calls the fourth category, the parables of separation. And this is when Jesus makes it clear that we do have to make a choice. And we either choose to be a part of the kingdom of heaven or we want. And one of those parables is the wheat and the tares, where there's wheat and tares growing up together, and the servants say, should we go and try to get the tares out? And the farmer says, no. At the end, when we cut it all, we'll then separate them out, the wheat from the tares, and we'll burn up the weeds, but we'll keep the valuable. And the other is another one of these parables that we kind of slide by. We remember the wheat and the tares, at least I do, but maybe not quite as much the fishing net, because it's a smaller parable. But he says somebody goes out and they fish, and they catch a net full of all kinds of fish, and they come back to shore, and then they separate it out. Some fish are good fish. Some fish are, we call these days, trash fish. We're not going to eat those. Can't use those. We're throwing them out. And so they separate the good from the bad. Only the good are used. The bad are just thrown away. They are useless. And he's telling us that we need to make sure that we are good fish. But here is the wonderful catch. The other parables, in a sense, have already set us up for this. I don't become a good fish out of my own strength, and my own power, my own piety, or whatever. That's the scribe who doesn't recognize that both the old and the new are treasures. That's the scribe who thinks, I can read and study for myself, and I can become good all by myself. No, instead we have to recognize that we have to have our hearts open to the gospel. And I do have to do that as much as I can. Make my heart open. Make my ears and my eyes open to the gospel, and receive the gospel. And let the gospel do its work in me. It's just tiny, a mustard seed or a little bit of yeast, but let it do its work in me. Let my soil be soft and fertile, so that the gospel can grow up, can begin to produce in me. Let me be willing to recognize that the gospel is so powerful. What little I have, I give, because the gospel gives so much more back. And then I find that because I've done these things, because I've allowed the gospel to work in me, I am judged to be good. Not because of my works, but because I allowed the gospel to work in me and through me. And so let us this week allow Jesus to ambush us in some way. We're tempted to go one way, or to do one thing, or to believe something, and instead we recognize Jesus would have us go in the opposite direction. And as he tells us, if we hear those things, we will be blessed. What a wonderful lesson this is for us this day and for always.